Hi, you guys. So let's talk about the Reformation in Europe. So, if you would like to learn a little bit more about the Reformation in a much more concise, much quicker format, take a look at Crash Course and look at his video on the Reformation. So, remember that during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church grows to be one of the largest and most powerful institutions in Europe. And because of the Renaissance, people began to question the practices of the church. Also, we have had the printing press, the creation of the printing press, and it has provided the opportunity for the common man to read the Bible for themselves. In addition, people really don't like having to pay taxes to the church. Critics of the church discuss how the leaders of the church itself are corrupt. For example, Pope Alexander VI had several children. Now, the problem with that is that priests and popes are supposed to have a vow of chastity, which means that they do not have a sexual relationship with any person while they are a member of the clergy. And the fact that the Pope has children clearly indicates that he has had a relationship with people because he has kids. So that's an issue. In addition, the lower clergy themselves could barely read, much less teach people because they don't have the education to do that. All right, they married, which they're not supposed to do. They drank to excess, which they're not supposed to do. And they gambled, which they're definitely not supposed to do. So these are some of the causes that led to the Reformation. Um, there were people who, prior to Luther, who advocated to bring about reform in the church. They believed that the Bible should have more authority than church leaders did. Here's a chart of causes. You have social, political, economic, and religious. In the social box, you have the Renaissance. In the printing press, politically, there were monarchs who challenged the church because they felt that they should have supreme authority and supreme power rather than the Pope. Um, and many leaders viewed the Pope as a foreign ruler, and they sought to challenge his authority. You have economic recent reasons. European princes and kings were very jealous of the church's wealth, and we talked about this a second ago. People resented having to pay taxes to the church. Um, and lastly, there are religious reasons. There are people who believe that church leaders were worldly and corrupt, and many people found some of the practices of the church, such as the selling of indulgences, to be unacceptable. So while he was about to become a lawyer, Martin Luther makes a change and he becomes an Augustinian monk. And then he becomes a teacher, he becomes a professor. He teaches scripture at the University of Wittenberg in Germany. Now remember, we're talking about Germany, so they pronounce their W's like V's. So he taught scripture at the University of Wittenberg, and he was concerned about the actions of Friar Johann Tetzel. Now, Tetzel was selling indulgences. An indulgence was a pardon that released a sinner from performing a penalty that the priest had given them for their sins. Now, the problem with indulgences, other than the fact that you had to pay for the indulgence in order to receive forgiveness from your sin, other than that, Tetzel also gave people the impression that they could buy their way into heaven for themselves as well as their dead loved ones. And that was something that greatly concerned Martin Luther. And so he wrote his 95 Theses, which are simply formal statements, he attacked the pardon merchants, is what he called them. On October 31st, 1517, he nails these statements, the 95 Theses, to the door of the Catholic Church in Wittenberg. And we call October 31st Reformation Day today. And it was with this action that this began the Protestant Reformation, which is a movement for religious reform. And ultimately, his actions bring about great change in the world of Christianity. Many churches were founded that did not accept the Pope's authority. These are called Protestant churches. The actions of Martin Luther ultimately changed Christianity in the way that they understood it, in the way that we understand it today. And it is something that we still see the effects of today. Luther discussed full reform of the church. He believed the following things. He believed that people could win salvation only by faith in God's gift of forgiveness. The church taught that faith and good works were needed for salvation, and Martin Luther believed that people only could receive salvation by faith alone, sola fide, faith alone. He also believed that church teaching should be based solely on the Bible, and he believed, therefore, that the Pope and church tradition are false authorities. He believed in Scripture alone, sola scriptura. He also believed that people who have faith, all people with faith, are equal to one another. And that meant that one person was not superior to another because of their religious faith. And he believed that people did not need a priest to interpret the Bible for them, that people could interpret, they could read the Bible and make those decisions for themselves. The Catholic Church was not happy with Luther, and they saw his protests as a way to challenge church control. And it was, by the way. It might not have started that way, but that is eventually how it becomes. At first, he is just seen as a rebellious monk who needs to be punished, but as his ideas start to catch on and they become more popular, the Pope decides that something has got to be done. And so in 1520, Pope Leo X issues a decree that threatens excommunication. Now, excommunication is the taking away of a person's right to membership in the church. So they kick him out, essentially. Now, this is something that my kids asked me in school. Remember that the Catholic Church is the only church at this time. We don't have other churches. So if Luther wanted to be a member of the church, he had to recant his statements. And the Pope threatening to kick him out is a big deal. So Luther just does not back down, and so Leo excommunicates Luther from the church. The Holy Roman Emperor, if you remember, we took a look of a map of Europe in the very first part of the video on the Renaissance, and it was a very large section of Europe. And the emperor is Charles V, and he is a devout Catholic. And where Luther lives in Wittenberg, Charles controls. He controls that area. So in 1521, he summons Luther to Worms. Remember, not W's, V's, so it's not worms, it's Worms, okay, to stand trial. And Luther is told that he must recant or take back his statements, and he refuses to do so. And a month later, the Edict of Worms is published, and it declares that Luther is an outlaw and a heretic. And a heretic is a person who holds beliefs that differ from church teaching. This is a vocabulary word that you need to know. All right. he declared that Luther was a heretic. And that is a person who has a belief that's different from official church teaching. And this edict said that nobody, no person, was to give Luther shelter or give him food. All of his books were to be burned. But Prince Frederick the Wise of Saxony, which is a mouthful, Prince Frederick ignores this edict and he provides shelter to Luther. And while he is in hiding in one of Frederick's castles, Luther translates the New Testament into German and he uses vernacular. If you remember from the Renaissance video, this is a vocabulary term that you need to know as well, that it is the common language. Luther translates the New Testament into common language so that people can read the Bible for themselves and understand it. And that becomes a big issue for the Catholic Church. Luther and his followers are called Lutherans. Today, there are Lutheran churches that you can attend. In 1524, German peasants revolt because they want to end serfdom. They have read Luther's teachings and they want to decide for themselves. Because that was one of the premises of Luther's statements, that people could decide for themselves their church teaching, and they wanted to decide for themselves how they were going to survive. And so they revolt. And Luther is horrified that people have taken his thoughts and his opinions about the church and have applied them to other things. So he encourages the princes of that area to put down the revolt. And ultimately, when they do so, about 100,000 people die. Remember that the term Protestant is applied to Christians who belong to non-Catholic churches. So, for me, my family and I go to a Southern Baptist church. That is a Protestant church. We have Methodist, you have Church of Christ, Episcopalian, so many things. The Anglican Church in England, so many, any church that is not Catholic is Protestant, and we celebrate every year because of Luther's transformation. All right, so Charles V, remember he's the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire who is devoutly Catholic. He decides that he's going to go to war with the Protestants, the princes who were Protestant. And this war lasts not quite 10 years, but it lasts for several years. And he finally, toward the end, he calls everybody to Augsburg, which is in Germany, and he has everybody sign the Peace of Augsburg, and it declares that each ruler will have the right to choose their state's, i.e., their country's own religion. So let's talk about Henry VIII. I love talking about Henry VIII because he and his family were just utterly fascinating to me. Um, This is in England. Henry VIII was the king in England. If you remember from the Renaissance video, we looked at one of his portraits. He was a devout Catholic. So much so that when Luther published his works, he wrote very strongly worded articles about Luther. And the problem, and that he's going to run into is that he wants a son. Now, remember that during this time period, in order to pass kingship from one generation to the next, the king has to have a son. It was not common for a daughter to become the queen. As a matter of fact, there have not been a ton of queens, solely queens, in England's history. And Henry wants a son. And he is married to Catherine from Spain. Catherine of Aragon is her name. And she is Catholic. Spain is Catholic. And the Pope in Spain, or the Pope, sorry, had a very good relationship with the King of Spain. And so Henry wants a divorce from Catherine, and that is something that Catholics don't allow. You cannot get divorced if you're a Catholic. And so he requests an annulment. Now, you get an annulment when you have not had a relationship with one another. And this is a problem for Henry and Catherine because they have had like 3 or 4 children, so they clearly have had a relationship with one another. Um, the problem with that, though, is that all of Catherine's sons that she has had have died. The only remaining child that they have had that has survived is Mary, Mary the First. And so Henry requests an annulment. And the Catholic Church is like, we're not giving you an annulment. You clearly have children. So Henry takes steps to to resolve the marriage himself. So he calls Parliament together and he tells them to pass a set of laws that will end the Catholic Church's power in England. And he wants them to make him the head of the church. And so they do it. And Henry becomes the head of the Church of England. Ultimately, the actions of Henry lead to some pretty terrible things, but some pretty good things as well. Um, when when he gets rid of Catherine, he banishes her and Mary, his oldest child. And Catherine is Catholic, and so she raises Mary as Catholic. And so Mary, so Henry has 3 children total. He has Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. And Edward is king. He comes because when Henry dies, he's like 9, and he dies when he's like 13, 14, 15 years old. And so then Mary becomes the queen, which, is very rare for this time period. And because, I mean, we talked about this in my class in person. Being banished with your mother because you're not a boy really is gonna like cause some mental issues with this poor sweet woman. So she makes England Catholic again, and she begins to kill anybody who is Protestant who will not become Catholic again. And Mary the First is known as the Bloody Mary, okay? Because she kills a bunch of people. But the good part about Henry's actions are that his daughter, Elizabeth I, she was his second child. When Mary is kicked out of the monarchy, Elizabeth I becomes the queen. And, from the Renaissance, we talked about Elizabeth I and about her encouragement of the arts in the Elizabethan age. This is the same um, Elizabeth. This is the same Elizabeth. And she she establishes the Anglican Church in England. And the Anglican Church is still the Church of England today. Um, so while Henry's actions might have had some negatives and some positives, we still see some of those um, results to this day. So for funsies, I put this in because I want y'all to know. Henry was so desperate to have a son that he married 6 times. So the first Catherine he married was Catherine of Spain, remember? She's the mother of Mary. She was actually close to Henry's age. She was maybe 3 or 4 years older than he was. And she was in her 40s when she could not have any more children, and she was banished. And so he marries Anne Boleyn. She is in her 20s, and she is the mother of Elizabeth the First. And she does something to make him mad, and she ultimately is beheaded. Then he marries Jane Seymour. Now, Jane is the golden wife because she gives him a son, Edward. The problem with Jane is that she has trouble in childbirth, and as a result, she dies a week later. Then he marries Anne of Cleves. Now remember, he's getting older and these women are getting younger. He marries Anne of Cleves and she gets off good. He divorces her, you know, divorces her. He then marries Catherine Howard and she is executed as well. I cannot remember if she was beheaded or if he just executed her, but she was executed as well. Let's see. Last but not least, he marries Catherine Parr. She outlives Henry, good for her. She outlives Henry, and yes, I just Googled it. Catherine Howard was beheaded as well. So if you look at the order of his wives, the first one was banished, the second one beheaded, the third one dies. The fourth one is divorced, the fifth one is beheaded, and the sixth one outlives him, right? Henry was very desperate for a son, in case you can't tell. So let's swerve back to Luther, right? So technically, the establishment of the Church of England would fall under the Protestant Reformation because we have established a new church in England. Um, but we also establish other churches as well as a result of Luther's teaching. And more people are reading the Bible for themselves and they are coming up with their own beliefs. Some of those people include John Calvin. John Calvin believed in predestination, which is the belief that God has known since the beginning who will be saved. His teachings are called Calvinism, and those who believe them today are called Calvinist. Followers of John Knox, who also studied Calvin and Calvinism, um, are known as Presbyterians. They originate in Ireland, I believe. The Anabaptist believed that a person should only be baptized if they were old enough to be a Christian. The Anabaptists are the people who eventually will become the Amish and the Quakers. Protestant churches are growing in number. They're growing into millions of people who are becoming Protestant. And the Catholic Church decides that they need to reform themselves. So they do. And this is known as the Counter Reformation. The group called the Jesuits is formed. They are a part of the clergy, but they are not priests. They're a separate group. And at the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church affirmed their beliefs. And they said that this is what they believe, and if you are going to be Catholic, you must have these beliefs as well. Right, so that is all of our notes, you guys, for the Reformation. I hope that this video has been helpful for you as you are studying for your test. And remember to take a look at the Renaissance video as well because we will be testing on those two chapters together.